product at the higher price and the amount of profits patent holder actually made by selling its product at the lower price because of the presence of that substitute. The difference between the two becomes my damage that I can claim. So this particular aspect only pertains to the fact that there was an erosion in the original higher price that I as a claimant used to charge because I enjoyed that monopoly in the market, or I enjoy that reputation in the market, which I no longer do because of the presence of fake products or counterfeit products. Now we come to the valuation approaches. Typically, as I said, there are three approaches. There's a market, there's an income, and there's a cost approach. What does the market approach says? A market approach is a process by which a fair value estimate is derived by analyzing similar intangible assets that have recently been sold or licensed, and then comparing these transactions to the subject intangible asset. So this simply says that if I want to value an X patent, or the worth of an X patent, if I want to quantify, I will look at similar patents or similar technology. I will look at any transactions that have happened in the market for those similar patents and technology, and that will help me arrive at a benchmark value for the subject IPR that I'm valuing. Now, as simple as that seems or it sounds, it's difficult to find exactly closely comparable intangibles or intellectual property rights. This particular market approach may be applicable in case of licenses and certain trademarks. However, if you take an example of, say, pharma sector, and maybe Dr. Rao can add more on that, it is very difficult to find a closely comparable patent wherein you can use a market approach and you can apply that market approach on the valuation of your pharma company's patent, because they're very unique. The R&D that goes into it is very unique. Maybe in case of certain trademarks in FMCG sector, such kind of a market approach may be applicable. But this market approach cannot be a primary approach. It has to be a secondary approach which will corroborate the primary approach, which has to come either from income approach or cost approach, because of the challenges that it has. In case you have any questions, once the presentations are over, we can address all of them. Then comes the income approach. The entire income approach basically relies on the fact that there are future cash flows or there are future benefits that are attributable to the subject intellectual property rights. So it talks about exploitation of that IPR in future, and the projected period can be defined as a 5-year period or a 10-year period, and how you exploit that IPR in the long run in terms of cash flows. So here the entire finance theory comes into the picture, where you have the revenue, the cash inflows, all the costs associated with commercialization and exploitation of that IPR, and how do you incur capital expenditure or operating expenses to ensure that certain stream of revenue is guaranteed in future. After you arrive at the net cash inflows attributable in future, you compute the present value, or you discount those future cash flows to a present date. This is called a present value concept of the future cash flows, which is an income approach. Now, within this income approach, there are different methods, such as multi-period excess earnings method, wherein if I'm valuing an intangible asset, I will first compute the total revenue attributable for that particular company, and I will deduct from there all the costs that are associated with contributory asset charges, or CAC as we call it, net income less CAC, which is contributory asset charge, which basically means that all the assets that I have in the company, whether it is the fixed assets, it's the assembled workforce, it's the working capital, or other intangible assets, I will first deduct a charge on all those other assets from this net income, whatever is left over or whatever is the excess earnings is the income attributable to my subject intangible asset. The second is a royalty savings approach, which simply says, going back to the previous example, if I have future stream of revenue, I will pay a percent of that revenue for the use of technology or brand which I'm licensing from the legal owner. So the present value of those royalty savings will determine the fair value of the brand or the intangible. The third is the profit premium or incremental cash flow method, which basically says that there are two scenarios of cash flows. One scenario assumes that the company owns the intangible. Other scenario assumes that the company does not own the intangible or the IPR. The difference between the two would give you a benchmark assessment of the quantum of that IPR. And finally, there's a direct discounted cash flow method, which is basically all the cash inflows and the outflows associated with the intangible, after which you compute the present value of the same. We finally have the cost approach, which says that the cost approach is based on the economic principle of substitution and price equilibrium. Prudent investor would pay no more for the subject intangible asset or the IPR than the price of that property of comparable utility. So there are two sub-methods within the cost approach. One is a reproduction cost, which basically says that if I have to reproduce this IPR or an intangible, what will be the total cost to construct this internally, which will have the similar properties as the intangible that I'm looking. The second is the replacement cost, which says it is the cost to recreate the utility of the subject IPR, but in a form or appearance that may be different from the exact replica. So it's a reproduction cost or a replacement cost. Software is a typical example, especially in case of IT companies, where people use either a reproduction cost or a replacement cost. Typically, a reproduction cost, in case it's an internally generated software, wherein they would compute the total man hours required to reproduce a similar software, which will then give an indication of the value of that software. Okay, I am at the end of the section with a small case study where I have explained how would you value intellectual property rights associated with a molecule which is not even commercialized. Okay, so in order to have the commercial angle, the first and the pertinent aspect is to divide the entire phase of that patent into 3 stages, and that will be divided by the valuation date. So we first assess at what point of time we want to quantify the value of that, the value of the intellectual property rights associated with that molecule. See, I'm not talking about the value of that drug. I'm not even talking about the value of the molecule. I am talking about the value of the intellectual property right associated with that molecule or associated with the drug which will eventually use this molecule. So these aspects are very different, because the intellectual property rights, as Mr. Rao also mentioned earlier, it's important not just to create it, but also to protect it and commercialize it. And once you quantify the IPRs associated with that particular molecule or patent, that remains with it till the time the patent expires. So we first ascertain what is the valuation date. After the valuation date, we will have to arrive at the financial projections or cash flows during the life of the patent. It is first important to find out what is the economic life of the patent, when does the patent expire, and after the patent expired, how will the projections look like. So prior to valuation date, what is important? Prior to valuation date, it is important to understand the entire technical aspects, where we need help of company technical people and R&D experts such as Mr. Rao. What they would help us in understanding is what are the details of the IPR or the molecule that is being developed. What are the different therapeutic areas or categories that molecule will cater to? What are its strengths? Then what are the details of regulatory approvals that have already been acquired within India or within developed nations? Then what are the details of the development or the regulatory cost that have already been incurred till date? What are the details of the R&D procedure, the overall research that will be carried out, and details of the patent which is registered for the IPR. So prior to commencing the entire exercise, we need to understand all these aspects which are more technical and R&D related, which will help us arrive at the fact that what is really the market that we are looking at. Because see, what we as financial experts would do is put a value to the IPR associated with the molecule. Now, in order to do that, we need to understand which markets the company is looking at where this particular molecule would eventually be commercialized. So we need to find out what the company has in its mind, which are the target market segments that they have, and what is the estimated market share that they're looking at. Once we have this basic information in place, we go to the second phase where we have financial projections during the life of the patent, where the patent has not expired. For each identified market, and here I'm specifically talking about developed markets because there are very stringent procedures in terms of commercialization of IPR. So assuming there are 4 phases of development, the initial R&D, the preclinical trials, the clinical trials, and finally the regulatory approvals before the product is launched. There has to be, because I am doing the valuation exercise even prior to a phase 1, for me it is important to assign a probability factor for each phase. Why that is important is because after completion of all these 4 phases, the total cash flows that I will be able to generate would have to be multiplied by this probability factor, because I am valuing the worth of this IPR as of today before it is commercially launched. So first is the phase of development that you can see. Then is the probability of success, which there are various research reports that for a particular molecule in a particular therapeutic area in certain developed regions, what are generally the range of probability success rates. Then what is the cost of development? Because in the initial 4 to 6 year period, you will only incur costs because your product has not been commercialized. So it's a long period, it's a gestation period before you start generating revenues. And of course, what is the timeline applicable for each phase? So for phase 1, 2, 3, 4, what is the probability factor for success, that whether this molecule or patent will move on to the next phase? B, what is the cost that the company would incur? And C, what is the timeline? Once you have all these factors in place, after the completion of phase on regulatory approvals, the launch of the product happens. So what is the combined probability factor for the launch of the product? As you can see in the red circle area on the slide, it is T. T is P into Q into R into S, which basically says that the combined probability for the launch or the commercial launch of this IPR is the probability of success for all the 4 phases, all 4 phases of development mentioned here. After that, in the bottom right hand side corner, you will see my simple P&L or a financial statement of any company, that this is my estimated revenue year over year that I will generate during the life of the patent. What is my cost of development, which I've already covered in these 4 phases? What are my operating expenses? Because once the product is developed, you will also need certain operating expenses to manufacture it on a year over year basis. The working capital norms, the capital expenditure norms, all these together will help me arrive at the net cash inflows that I would be able to generate out of this intellectual property right in future post completion of these 4 phases. Once I